All right. Good morning, everybody. Today I got Dan Olson is going to lead the way on phosphorus optimization and management practices for corn and soybeans. So we're going to dive a little bit away from talking more some of the seed stuff and biological stuff. We're going to dive into kind of some soil fertility things today. So I promise, and I was texting Dan last night that this presentation will go better than the Super Bowl for the Patriots last night. So I can assure you guys that. But Dan Olson's our agronomist out of southern Minnesota and hails out of kind of the New Ulm area and covers kind of all of Minnesota for us. So, Dan, I'll let you take her away.
Well, good morning. Thank you, Jake. Like Jake said, my name is Dan Olson. I'm out of New Ulm, Minnesota, sales agronomist here. Yeah, sort of that football game was sort of a snoozer, so hopefully nobody stayed up too late and we're going to fall asleep during this presentation. But what we're going to be starting off, we're phosphorus optimization is the main point of our little presentation today, but we're going to start off with a little soil fertility 101 just to get you going. Just a lot of times it's forgotten about and so on, but that plant, there's like 13 mineral units. There's a major group or macro, your nitrogen, your phosphorus, potassium. That's when we're putting your nitrogen, your anhydrous in the fall, your urea, your 28%, spreading it out there, large amounts, phosphorus. That's your MAP and DAP, and then your potash. Next group is secondary. Again, these are products that we do, apply out in the fields, but smaller amounts, but are very important to that plant's life cycle and its yield potential. And just finishing with the micronutrients, there's a bunch of them there: boron, chloride, copper, iron, magnesium, molybdenum, zinc. Again, these are product or fertilizers or nutrients that are used a little bit less in that plant, but are very critical in that life cycle of that. A lot of these are, can be applied, but are just, in the mineralization of the soil. That's where that plant gets that. So as we're getting towards that phosphorus management, just going to highlight some of the points or needs of these major or macronutrients in that plant. So nitrogen, we put a lot of it. We talk a lot, the nitrogen price out there. Why is that important? Nitrogen is in part of every living plant cell in that plant. That's its food. It needs that. It helps in the chlorophyll synthesis, which makes that darker green color when you're out there going around in the field. Next, phosphorus. Again, this is a macro major. This helps in the photosynthesis of that plant, the respiration, the energy storage, the cell elongation and division in that plant. And a big thing is that early root formation and growth as we get out there planting and get it going, get it out of the ground. Phosphorus, your potash you apply out there, helps in the protein synthesis, the translocation of the heavy metals such as iron out there in your soils. And a big thing is that it helps that plant defend against disease that it's going to see throughout the year, and then giving you some good grain formation at the end of the year.
So I'll kind of cover this one here. So this is a really busy slide. I tried to slice and dice it by each one, but it ended up getting blurry. So this is all in kilograms per hectare. But it's a really good visual when you look. So you see all your different nutrients there. So you got nitrogen in the top left, phosphorus in the top right, potassium kind of middle left there. And so what this represents is, so on the left is the pounds of uptake to essentially make a corn crop. So if the axis on the left and the axis on the right is essentially the total pounds of what's being used, if that makes sense. So if you look at like on the phosphorus side there, you can kind of see, there's not a lot needed right away in a plant's life, and then which would be the bottom axis would be over time. And then when you look at like you get out to that, that kind of middle time frame on that phos, you can see how much of that phosphorus gets translocated in that plant or gets taken up for grain fill, which would be that blue color. The next one down would be the tassel, cob, and husks. Obviously not a lot. The stalk and leaf, and then the leaf blades. You look at the big one there. If you go down to potassium, you can kind of see how that ratio changes. Potassium is found a lot more in the stalk and leaves for nutrient transfer, those kind of things. Like Dan was saying on disease, that's where that gets to be so critical. So it kind of is a nice visualization because we always, especially with corn, we always think, oh, everything is just, we just need nitrogen, and as long as we're, somewhat adequate on the other two, we'll grow a good crop. And that's, it really shows the importance of what those nutrients do at different times of the year. As you can all see, when we get into that rapid growth stage or that rapid vegetative growth, once we pass that V7, V8 to get to VT, you can see that that sharp uptick on every nutrient there. But and what's interesting to me, especially, is after we get to that where that peak kind of flattens off, you can see how that plant is reallocating those nutrients and or taking up different nutrients to go different places.
So yes, I mean those three macros are huge in that plant's yield potential. So I mean, what happens when we start taking some of these away or reducing them out in that plant? That plant is like a factory. I mean, if you start taking some things away from it, it's not going to run at peak efficiency. So, I mean, we're going to be losing some in the end. So as we talk the phosphorus, one of those macros, this is one we see quite a bit out there, even though guys do testing and they say have it out there, but they just can't utilize it. It's being tied up. So what sort of affects, what's our phosphorus tie up or whatever you want to call it in our soils, even though we have it out there? pH has a huge effect on that phosphorus availability to that plant. Just some basics, just pH in general, 7 is neutral. So now think of that as your base and so on. Ideal for your corn and soybean plants out there is around that 6 to 6.5, give or take a little bit either way. So that's at that range is when that plant enjoys it the most. But the thing is, a lot of our soils are not. That's what our soils are. That's what the glacier gave us, depending on where you are part of the world. So what causes that with the pH? Our acidic soils, which if we look at less than 6 pH, our phosphorus is tied up in our aluminum and iron. So in our alkaline soils, which are 7.5 pH and above, a lot of it's being tied up by our calcium that's in our soils. So if you look at that graph, again, a little bit busy, but it just sort of shows how that availability in the soil that plant can take up. So you're looking around that 6 to 7, oh boy, don't do the hand thing. That area is when that plant can get the best utilization of your phosphorus out in your soils.
So this is kind of just a graph because a lot of people say, well, we're talking phos is the big thing. And this is kind of just a different representation of what Dan had there. But the biggest thing that I want to show, so like as we get into kind of a little bit tighter commodity prices, people are cutting back. People say, well, how low or how critical is lime to the soil profile? And this is kind of a graph that really hits home. So there's a lot of soils where I live in Wisconsin, not locally, but around the area. There's a lot of soils that guys are trying to farm at a 5 to 5.4 pH, 5.5. And they say, well, how critical is that? And they'll, whether it's rented ground or something like that, and we'll go out there and we'll try to put a Band-Aid on a gunshot wound and we'll go bulk spread DAP. I'm going to tell you that's probably not the best investment that you can do right now. When you're at a 5.0 pH, 70% of your phosphorus that's available in the soil, you're losing 70% of the available phos in the soil profile. So, versus if you'd crank that up to a 6.5, 7, whether that be through lime or just finding different ground, those kind of things, that pH is, like Dan said, is very, very critical, especially for phosphorus, just with the interactions. And you can kind of see those heavy metals that Dan was talking about. The iron is on there, and how available that is. And you can see as iron is super available, phosphorus is not very available. So all those nutrients, and if you look at that, about that 6.5 to 7 is kind of the happy medium where most nutrients are the most available, which is why Dan was saying, that 6 to 7 is kind of the slot for for most of our nutrients. So everybody always asks, how much phosphorus do we have? Like what if I'm looking at a soil test, what am I looking at? And I'm going to kind of dive into that here. So we'll get into what phosphorus deficiency looks like. The far right picture is one I took up by Ashland, Wisconsin, back 3 years ago. But this is a good representation for line item number 3. I'm going to let Dan take over here, but I'll explain that for when we get all done. So,
Yeah, definitely. So, I mean, what's causing our deficiency out there? I mean, we talked pH because that was a big thing there initially. I mean, that soil type and pH has a huge impact at the graphs we've shown. Also, that early planting and poorly drained soils. I just want people to think on that. I mean, we are getting in earlier and earlier, so we're putting that seed, that plant into conditions that are maybe not as favorable and for temperature wise. And then a big thing too is our equipment. I mean, we are getting bigger and faster, so we're getting more acres put in those same type of conditions. Poorly drained soils, is it rented? Do we probably won't invest in that? Or like Jake was saying, some fields that maybe shouldn't be farmed, but that has a huge effect there also on your phosphorus deficiency. Soil compaction, a lot of times we'll see it on the headlands. You think of, again, like I said, mentioned the equipment, maybe our grain cart operator, Shelby, is always driving in the same spot. So we start to see them in certain areas of the field. Your hard pan, your sidewalls, again, if we're doing a little planting, a little maybe so-so conditions, we're getting a little sidewall compaction that has effect in it. And the last thing there, I mean, just plain and simple, hey, unless you're testing, we just might not have the fertilizer out there, if it's a rented ground or ground that we're not going to invest a lot into it. So, so those are just some of the conditions and causes that we see the phosphorus deficiency out there. Go
yep.
ahead,
So
Jake.
so real quick, this picture on the right is an example of sidewall compaction. This is a call I went on. Oh, it was right after the 4th of July. I believe it was 2023. So it was extremely, extremely dry. This is way up by Lake Superior. They've got a lot of very heavy red clay that turns to a brick when it gets dry. And they had been wet early on. They had mudded things in, and then the rain completely shut off. Or maybe it was 2020, yeah, 2023 it would have been. Sorry. But so what you're seeing there, and it's kind of hard to see, but you can see where the corn kind of looks like it disappears. That corn is so purple it's almost black. And it's because the roots were only growing in the furrow, going straight down like a mohawk because they could not penetrate that sidewall. So that's typically when we see, like I call it the train wreck phosphorus deficiency scenarios, it usually has something to do with compaction or something that occurred early on in that season. Call it human induced usually. We can't control the weather, obviously, but we can control if we go out there and mud something in. So signs of deficiency in corn. So purple reddish leaves on the lower, your older leaves. So that starts on the bottom and works its way up the plant. You'll see stunted growth, so kind of some shorter internodes in between the leaf collars. You'll notice that it almost looks like miniature corn, if you will. Really thin, spindly stalks. This is typically something you see when you get low pH induced phos deficiency because you also start to run into potassium issues, which leads to those thinner stalks later season. And then the big thing that everybody forgets about, and this is true of a lot of nutrient deficiencies, is every time we're deficient nutrients, we're not letting that plant grow like it normally should, which then in turn delays maturity of corn and soybeans both. So that's one thing a lot of guys don't realize. They're like, oh, I might take a 10 bushel yield hit. Well, you could potentially be adding 2, 3, 5 points of moisture depending on how bad that deficiency is too. So, and then the biggest thing at the bottom there, obviously, is kind of a no-brainer, but all of that leads to reduced yield on the corn side.
And what I mean, I don't know if Jake mentioned it, but I mean that purple and red leaves that you see in the plant, is a huge, a big indicator, of course, when you see that. But I mean, I think Jake would probably, there is actually some genetic backgrounds that do throw a little purple, but that is not the cause of that. So, I mean, do some investigating when you're out there looking. I mean, it's not always that, but high percentage is that. So, would you agree,
Yeah,
Jake, on some of the,
yeah, on the genetic side, so typically where you're going to see that purpling, if it's genetic, is on that bottom, on that coleoptile leaf or the first true leaf. You'll see that leaf sheath turn a very kind of vibrant purple color. I'm sure a lot of you, if you've walked corn early season, you've seen it. When we start getting it to jump up into the leaf tissue like this picture, that's beyond genetics. That's
yep,
a phosphorus deficiency, especially when you see that stunted plant. I mean, you're looking at corn there that's only probably 5-6 inches tall. That's V1, 2, 3, 4. You're looking V4 pushing V5 corn that's 6 inches tall, and that's when the red flag comes out. And you might sometimes on some genetics, about halfway up the leaf, you'll see two little purple kind of smudges on either side, on one or two leaves going up. To really be true phos, you'll see it kind of along the leaf margins first and work its way from the outside towards the inside. So,
yep. Oh, yeah. So, good. There's the corn. So, signs of deficiency in the soybeans, again, some of the similar things. I mean, that stunted growth, the internodes, smaller leaves, just miniature looking plant out there as you see the photos to the right. The necrosis and spotting, that dark brown interveinal, discoloration in that leaf there are some key indicators that we're having some issues out in that field. Again, some delayed maturities. I mean, that plant's going to be behind. So come harvest time, we could see some, green stems that might have some of the issues out there when we come to harvest. And again, like the corn, I mean, our Leo loss, the potential is not there. We're shutting down that. We're not letting that factory run in peak optimum running. So a lot of different little things. So we can move to the next one, Jake, unless you had something there.
no, just on the bottom right two images there. So the top is so this is the trial. It was done. I found it on a university site, but I thought it was a really good one. So they artificially shorted the plants on the bottom. They shorted them phosphorus. It was kind of a plot to show the difference. So those plants are actually at the same growth stage or very similar. You can just see the difference in the foliage. The leaves are a lot smaller. There's not as much leaf area, so you're not closing that row as fast. They're stunted back, the nodes shorten up. So it kind of, and not to beat on my Wisconsin guys, but I walk a lot of bean fields in Wisconsin early season, actually through the mid season that look like that bottom picture there. And a lot of these are on soils that were a sub 6.0 pH, usually around a 5.5. So, but that's, phosphorus to show a little deficiency. It takes usually a lot of deficiency on phos to get that leaf flash, if you will. Unlike potassium, which is kind of a highlighter yellow look on the soybeans, the phosphorus deficiency, when you start seeing that up on the leaf tissue and you really start to see it there, you're hemorrhaging bushels. Usually you can lose 3 to 5, 10 bushel by that stunted plant look, and it's kind of just like, oh, my bean yields are off. But when you start to see the leaves purpling on soybeans, the wheels have fallen off the bus. So just keep that in mind. Okay, so just to here's that picture again. So product rates versus return on investment. And this is a question, and I'm not going to get too into the weeds on telling guys what they should or shouldn't do, based on their fertility program and everything. There's way too many variables. We can handle that if anybody's got questions or anything, I can handle that on a one-on-one basis. But this is just kind of some things to think about, and kind of some common issues I see guys running into. So in our soil profiles, depending on where you live, and this isn't true of ever, but there can be upwards 800 to 1,000 pounds of phosphorus per acre that's essentially like in a reserve, or it's tied up in that soil profile. The biggest thing is it needs to get mineralized into plant usable formula. So like it's whether it's tied up from, like Dan was saying, like iron or aluminum, or on the high side, calcium. It's there, it's just not, or if we have the pH swings, it's just not usable. So even though it's there, we can't use it. And we'll talk about that on the soil testing side here in a second. So only about 20%, and that number can vary, can be anywhere from 15 to 30, but ballpark 20% of phosphorus that you apply in this cropping year. So if you go out and you're spreading DAP in a normal soil in the state of Wisconsin where I live, 20% of that is only available for this year. So the rest of what you're applying becomes tied up Whether that frees up in 7 days, it might free up in 2 years. It depends on, what each little granule, where it lands and what's by it and all that stuff. It's a kind of a micro scale there, but that stuff, it will get tied up before it becomes usable again. So there's not a lot of that phos. And with some liquid starters, there's some phos stabilizers out there in the market that do work pretty decent for keeping like 1034O, keeping that phosphorus from being tied up, when you're putting it in furrow. There's products out there like that, but for bulk spreading, there's really not a lot of products out there. So just removal rates on corn. So 180 bushel corn takes 63 pounds of phos out of the profile. Soybeans at 50 bushel, kind of just used, ballpark, because we got guys from North Dakota that 140 bushels their environment, and I realized we got guys in southern Minnesota that 180 would be a crop failure. But just for intents and purposes, just look at my example here. So soybeans at 50 bushel, let's just ballpark call it 40 pounds of the acre. So this is the question I've been getting. Can I cut my starter? Can I cut my 1034O? Can I cut my DAP? Can I cut my MAP? You name your phosphorus source to save dollars an acre. The first thing I'm going to always say is soil test levels, soil test levels, soil test levels, or soil test, soil test, soil test. It is not I can't give anybody a blanket number on what we should be doing or whatever without looking at it. But you really have to look at your soil. When you start asking these questions, you have to look at your soils like a nutrient savings account. So if you're adequate or high levels of phos, say we're in excessive, and we'll get to the Bray 1 versus Bray 2 and the Olson test stuff here in a second. But if it says that, then yes, maybe we can cut. But it's not necessarily, there might be dollars in the budget, where we can maybe, hey, we should maybe be putting out a little bit more nitrogen, or hey, maybe I should be, putting out a fungicide pass or whatever. And those are maybe where we look at reallocating dollars from phos to something else. If it's not adequate, or it's low in phos, or even if we have low pH soils, to a certain degree on that low pH thing, I would not recommend cutting phosphorus. That's probably the number one nutrient that everybody goes to first when they look at cutting stuff. Then it's followed by potassium, and then it's usually nitrogen last, especially on corn. A lot of times on beans, people don't even, realize what phosphorus is. And then they look at maybe just not putting potash, or putting it all on for the corn crop, ripping tremendous corn yields off, and then there's not enough left for the beans. So my question always is can you tap into that savings account in the soil? So Dan Volkert is my Vanna White. He's down on a beach somewhere in Mexico today, so I had to use him here. But we'll get to, so that picture that you're looking there is untreated on the left and NutriQuire on the right, which we'll get to NutriQuire at the end of this presentation. But so assuming ideal pH, if we're pulling that 180 bushel corn, 63 pounds of phos, if my soil test level is 10 parts per million in the soil, that means I've only got 20 pounds of phosphorus available for that crop. And people will be like, and there's a lot of areas where we're fertilizing for 180, or where I shouldn't say fertilizing, we're hoping for 180, but we only are putting down that maybe 20 pounds of phos, 30 pounds of phos trying to cut. But that at that level, we're still 43 pounds of phosphorus left that we need for that crop. This year, I'm afraid there's a lot of acres that aren't going to get that extra 43 pounds. And then when you have those scenarios, you're probably looking at 150 bushel corn. So, do you cut the nutrients? Like I said, a lot of different factors, but the one that you have to factor in when you're making these decisions is you have to think about not, it's the cutting the phos, or cutting whatever nutrient you're going to look at cutting is kind of a knee-jerk decision for today, and I totally understand it. But what you got to think is that 2, 3, 5 years down the road, especially if this is stuff you're farming long term, is if we rob Peter to pay Paul, Peter's going to get mad after a while and come looking for his money. So that's we can't just rob that soil profile. You have to be able to bite the bullet essentially and replace that fertility 2, 3, 5 years down the road at some point. So. And then, like I said, soil test. No decision should ever be made on a fertility recommendation just on a knee-jerk reaction. Always look at the soil test first, and I'll let Dan kind of dive into that here. So,
yeah, definitely led into it nicely. I mean, so you're thinking there, well, how do I know? And like Jake said, hey, we need a soil test. We got to see what's out there. And there's definitely tests that we can run when you're doing your soil samples to find out what you have out there available, tied up, and so on. And this depends on sort of going back to initially what we were talking about, some of the pHs out there. So there's two tests out there. I mean, on the Bray side to help see what's out there. Like this says, the Bray 1, when you do that test, it's going to show you what's actually available for that plant to utilize. You using the Bray 2 is going to be show you that reserve or what's tied up in the soil. The pH affects that, so that's why we said the phosphorus reacts to the iron and aluminum in your soil to form aluminum phosphate. So that's why it's sort of tying up, or you can't utilize it. So now if you jump up and you see you got some levels a little higher, that's 7.4 and above, that's when you would run the Olson test. So in the high pH environments, the phosphorus binds to the calcium in your soil, not so much iron and aluminum. So, and that forms a calcium phosphate again, which is not available for that plant to utilize. So, but when you're doing your test, which we highly recommend, run them all. I mean, see what you got out there for the few bucks investment into it. You're going to have a lot better information on what's happening out in your field if you are seeing some issues and so on. So we can jump to the next one. Those are soil sampling questions. So
yeah, just real quick, Dan. So
yep.
that difference in that Bray 1 to Bray 2, that's a lot of guys will run like a Bray 1 and see what's there. Why the Bray 2 is important, like when we talk like a product like NutriQuire or some of there's products out there that help free up phos in the soil, whether it be, like a hard chemistry or a biological, those kind of things. So the Bray 2 will tell you what's there. And I can use an example. We've got a customer in Door County, a dealer, that his Bray 2s are off of the charts. He's got Bray 1s that are pretty much as low as you can physically get. And the reason is, and he's a weird situation, he has lower pH, but he's at extremely high calcium, very close to Lake Michigan, high calcium levels in his soil, and calcium is tying everything up between that and aluminum and other things. And he's been spreading DAP for the last 6, 8, 10 years, and his soil test levels are not moving at all. And he's been essentially trying to build the profile, and the profile will not build because when he was taking a Bray 1, the soil is only going to allow so much, or that buffer index, if you will, is only going to allow for so much to be available. Everything he's putting on is just going in, like say it's kind of like a direct deposit. If you had a 10% going into a checking account, 90% going into a savings, he's only putting 10%, which is getting used by the crop and then some, and everything is getting dumped into that Bray 2 side or that reserve side. So he's been throwing dollars at it. So rather than throwing more money at, the DAP side, he's looking at reallocating, okay, I can go dump $800 a ton DAP out here, or I can go out and figure out, a way to maybe move those dollars or figure out, spend it on something to free up that phos so I'm making more dollars per acre. So that's why that test is sometimes important, especially if you have, I know there's a lot of dealers in this call, and might be a few customers too, but like when you're looking at using a product like NutriQuire, if you have a high ratio of Bray 2 to Bray 1, like if those numbers seem excessively far apart, you will see a high response from a product like NutriQuire for helping free that up. But that's why that Bray 2 test, it's a little bit more money, but if you know you have super low phos, I highly suggest doing the Bray 2 because that's going to tell you, because a lot of times it's there, we just can't get it. And then testing for like if you run a full analysis of calcium, iron, aluminum, and you can kind of start to narrow down, okay, what is my problem? Not just, I know I have a problem, but I don't know what it is. You can actually narrow it down and figure out what you need to do.
So the next couple slides is how we're going to manage your soils to help release some of that phosphorus and so that plant can utilize it. So starting here is just, your pH. Again, this is what your soil level is. This is like previous slide, this is how stuff's being tied up or available or not. So in our low pH soils, lime. So what lime does is it increases the pH by converting the H and the hydrogen to H2O, which allows that pH to rise. The thing is with lime is that it is a short-term fix. This is not something that one application is going to correct it for long term. So you might need, multiple years. It's probably going to be part of your, management of your fertilizer is liming your field. But a big thing was this also to raise pH. It depends on where you're at and how effective, economically it will be to utilize that. So there's areas that yeah, I mean, what it costs to get the lime to you and applied is extremely high and not cost effective. But um, and then the last point on the next is, just applying more, going back to Jake's comment, is not the answer also. Because if you're only utilizing 10% of that 100 you're out there, I mean, you're just throwing money out there. So in the high pH soils, again, this is even more challenging, because there's less options for you, we'll call it. Um, Obviously, you can't lime because that's going to raise the pH. That's going to defeat the purpose of what you're trying to do out there. Products or nutrients that do lower pH are like a sulfur and gypsum, calcium. Um, but most areas, this is not cost effective, and really, it's just not a good management portion of it, depending on where you're at. So, I mean, in those high pH situations, I mean, we can put some, nutrients, side dressing, or so on right next to that plant that will help, that plant battle through those tough situations. And again, just don't apply more because it's not a good fix for that. So those are two, ways to try and help adjust the pH. Are they cost effective? Depends on where you're at. Long term, it's tough to say. Not really long term. So that's sort of the pH. And if we go to the next side, this is sort of the something that's gonna be a little more, you know, user friendly, cost effective is soil health. Soil health, having that soil break down, give you that P that you have out there, that phosphorus out there, helps a lot. So the major component of availability is converting it, being tied up so that plant can use it. So improving your soil health by introducing microbes will help convert that fixed phosphorus out there, like Jake was mentioning earlier. So on the Yield Master Solution side, the NutriQuire Terracin, these are bacterial products that will, boost that soil health and help convert that tied up phosphorus to a usable form, that plant can utilize.
Yep. So this is NutriQuire. A lot of you are probably familiar with this product. I in phosphorus situations, we do talk about this product working on potassium. We talk about it for breaking down and recycling nutrients in the soil. But when we know that we have phosphorus issues in the profile, whether that be on the excessively high side, on the excessively low side, maybe we have major pH issues. I call it where things are not definitely in balance, where things are kind of wonky. That's where NutriQuire really kind of hits a home run. So there's spore forming bacteria. Just real quick recap. There's spore forming bacteria that you put into the soil, whether it be in furrow, you can spray it on, you can put it in a 2x2. Lots of different ways to apply. And those spore forming bacteria essentially are eating organic material and humic acids, things like that in the soil, and the enzymes that they're secreting out the back free up that phosphorus that's tied up, and it breaks that bond from that iron, that aluminum, that calcium, to make it plant available. So it essentially is making that. I talked about that 20% being available, and I don't have a hard concrete number on this, but it essentially turns that number to say 30 or 40. So we're getting more of that phosphorus used up in a high phos environment. Sometimes that can be important if we're on dairies or high history manure where we need to drop that phos number for nutrient management plans. And also when we get phosphorus to be way excessively high, it can actually tie up other nutrients like zinc and some other things. So there's things that way too, that excessively high phosphorus is not always a good thing either. So, but NutriQuire does a really good job. The other side of it that we don't really talk about is on NutriQuire is recycling nutrients. When we're in a corn bean rotation, we're always relying on those corn stalks unless we're baling them or taking silage off. We're relying on those corn stalks for next year's fertility. In some of those years where we don't have, like I was across southern Minnesota here not too long ago, the other day, last week, and I can tell you that there's not a lot of moisture in the profile, or not a lot of snow melt coming. Now that I said that, well, I'll get 30 inches of snow next week, so you can thank me for that. But we don't have a lot of moisture there to begin with to start breaking those stalks down. And so if we have a lag period for that phosphorus to essentially get broke down out of those stalks or the microbes that are naturally in the soil to break that down, if we're lacking that moisture, lacking that breakdown, that 2 to 3 month lag period can sometimes be yield loss because we're not recycling those nutrients we're counting on. If you want to look at it, it's like if something was, if your paycheck was late or something like that, like it's just we're not getting it back into that savings account where it needs to be. So NutriQuire just kind of ramps that process up and helps that nutrient cycling too. And it's working mainly on phosphorus. The picture on the right there, you can see that's potassium. That's our knowledge pot of Baldwin. So the untreated checks on the left. The treated is on the right, same exact hybrid. That's when we pulled silage sampling, and you could see the difference in the potassium firing. Not necessarily phosphorus there, but just kind of see the difference. So, and then we have our NutriQuire Terracim. So the NutriQuire is in this product. I will say, if you know that you have major phosphorus issues, like I said before, if we have major imbalances, the liquid NutriQuire is probably your best bet. If you think phosphorus may be a little bit of a concern, but you feel like your soils are in check and you're getting good yields and you're kind of looking, what can I do for that next step or that next, how do I take my 220 bushel ground to 230 or 240? The NutriQuire Terracim is kind of that product. So the Terracim are in there. They're called PPFMs. They help with the iron and manganese uptake and some other micros. But what they're going to do on that, why they kind of work nice with the NutriQuire pairing, is we're getting a bigger root system and a greater root mass. The Terracim stimulate the meristematic tissue in the roots. So we're getting a little bit more surface area to take up that phosphorus, and then we're having the NutriQuire free it up, and we have that framework of the roots to help take it up. Kind of makes the world go round. So this is a planter box application for both corn and soybeans. Like I said, this is kind of, I call it like the fine tuning, going over a rough draft of a paper or something one last time is NutriQuire. The building blocks, we have a major problem, I need to correct it fast, is the NutriQuire liquid. So that's kind of the separating between the two there. All right. Have a great week, everybody, and this will end the call. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, everybody.